Historically, communities addressed water shortages by augmenting supplies, usually by building large infrastructure projects such as dams, pipelines, and aqueducts, and more recently, desalination plants. But this focus on source augmentation has depleted source waters around the world and undermined global freshwater ecosystems. Let me give you a couple of examples. In a typical year, many of the most important rivers in the world, such as the Nile in Egypt, the Yellow River in China, and the Colorado River in the US, no longer reach their deltas. In California, transfer of water to Los Angeles has desiccated Owens Lake, which now generates roughly 6% of the asthma and lung cancer-inducing airborne dust in the US. In this paper, we're describing an alternative vision in which the focus shifts from supply augmentation to improving what we call water productivity, which basically means getting more out of less water. One of the most obvious examples is loss of water from water distribution networks. In developing countries, for example, approximately 50% of the water that goes into the pipeline systems from the water treatment plants is lost, either through leakage in the pipelines or poor accounting. Imagine trying to run a business where you lost 50% of your product. I mean, it wouldn't be very viable. Even in well-run utilities, for example, in the United States or in Europe, the loss rates are on the order of 10%. So there's definitely improvement that we can make in that regard. Another example of how we waste water is runoff. Rainfall runs off of our roofs and our streets and directly into local streams. And the pollutant loading and flow velocities that are associated with that runoff are really a deadly one-two punch to our freshwater ecosystems. In developing countries, the number one concern really has to do with basic human needs, safe drinking water and sanitation. Those are the priorities. In developed countries, typically we have access to safe drinking water and we have adequate sanitation. And the problem is more typically a biodiversity issue. In other words, the ecosystem is suffering because of lack of fresh water. And both of those challenges can be addressed by improving water productivity, although the details of how that's done are going to be very community specific. The first is substitution, the second one would be regeneration, and the third is reduction. Substitution involves using lower quality water in place of higher quality water where appropriate. Treated wastewater might not be suitable for drinking, but it can be perfectly suitable for landscape irrigation. Using treated wastewater for irrigation saves drinking water and thus improves drinking water productivity. Another example is, or a second approach that's discussed in the paper, is what we call regeneration, which involves treating lower quality water so that it is, for all practical purposes, just as good as high quality water. An example is potable reuse, in which wastewater is treated using conventional and advanced techniques and then added back to the water supply. In Windhoek, Namibia, for example, highly treated wastewater has been added to the potable water distribution system more or less continuously since the late 1960s, with no obvious adverse health effects among the population of several 100,000 people. The third approach that we talk about in the paper is called reduction, which involves basically using less water to accomplish the same task. A great example is dual flush toilets. By installing dual flush toilets, which flush different volumes of water for urine and feces, a city the size of 1 million people can reduce municipal water use by upwards of 30% and substantially reduce electricity costs. The question becomes, how do we move from a situation of near crisis to a more sustainable situation? And one of the ways that we can begin to address that is through changing our relationship with water, which involves rethinking, not trying to get more water, which has kind of been the historical focus, but really instead rethinking about how we use the water and how we can use the water more productively.